Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us. We're going to take a couple of minutes to let people join and get connected. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. You want to say your name, where you're from, what organization you're with, and we will get started here in just a few moments. So thanks so much to everyone who is putting your information in the chat. We're very glad to have all of you here. I'm going to go ahead and just get started with the introductions, and I will keep an eye on the wait room. So my name is Geneva Blackmer. I'm the Interim Executive Director for the Interfaith Center at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization that seeks to unify people through relationship building, dialogue, and social action. And I'm very happy and excited to welcome our speaker today, the Reverend David Brandon Smith. He is a minister of Word and Sacrament in the Presbyterian Church USA, a research associate at Goethe University in Frankfurt, and the newly elected studies inspector at the Adolf Clarenbach House. He is also in the final phase of completing his doctorate in church history at the University of Bonn. Before accepting the position in Frankfurt, he was a research associate at the Bonn Center for Dependency and Slavery Studies. David holds a Bachelor of Arts in Religion and Philosophy from Montreat College, a Master of Divinity from Princeton Theological Seminary, and a Master of Arts in Ecumenical Studies from the University of Bonn. He spent a year at Rutgers University Graduate School of Social Work through the Princeton-Rutgers Partnership. He has served churches and nonprofit organizations in various capacities across the eastern United States, including posts in North Carolina, Maryland, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. Most recently, he was a pastor at Bryn Mawr Presbyterian Church in Pennsylvania. After taking a brief leave from his doctoral studies and returning to the U.S., in 2021, he also served as a resident chaplain at Thomas Jefferson University Hospital. David's publications crisscross various fields and disciplinary boundaries, including the history of world Christianities and ecumenics, I should know how to say this word, queer religious history, slavery and dependency studies, Christian social ethics, canon law, and religion in world affairs. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, David.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Geneva, for the very nice introduction that makes me sound very fancy. And of course, for the invitation to be with you. My thanks also to the Interfaith Center for hosting this. And of course, to everyone who took their Friday afternoon or evening to be with us here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that we'll have our PowerPoint presentation going. One moment. Third time is the charm. And here we are. Can you all see it now? Fantastic. I should ask, since several of you have your cameras on, is anyone from Namibia who's joining us today? You can raise your hand. No worries. Well, if you were, I would say you can chime in at any time. I mean, anybody else can too, but especially folks from Namibia. So, with all that said, I am happy to sort of introduce the topic for this evening. I will be presenting about the international ecumenical collaboration that we can bear witness to throughout the history of the struggle for an independent Namibia. Specifically, I will focus on the dimensions of that struggle from 1971 to 1990, although we will have a bit of background information to help us get started. And there we go. So when we ask questions about the role of the church in any political movement, we often encounter many different perspectives. This will not come as a surprise to most of you gathered here. I saw your introductions in the chat room. And so there are many different perspectives about the role of the church and the churches as institutions in the struggle for an independent Namibia that ultimately culminated on March 21st, 1990, with independence. Are these different perspectives simply that, a sort of pull of different political persuasions that lead people to have different conclusions, or are they perhaps indicative of a gap in historical research? Or again, are they perhaps a bit of both? In this picture, you can see on the screen, the first thing that probably sticks out to you is the famous Christuskirche, the Christ Church, which is perhaps the most famous building, definitely in Windhoek, but more generally in Namibia as well. This was a church built by and for the white German population, German-speaking population that colonized this area, and is still to this day a German-speaking congregation that is quite small. And directly behind it, if you look at this gold building, which is nicknamed the Kaffeemaschine, the coffee machine, because, you know, it kind of looks like a coffee machine, you can see the National Independence Museum, both right close together in this space. An interesting sort of fact about this National Museum is that while it was, of course, also constructed by people in Namibia, it was largely funded as a soft power exercise of the North Korean government. So we're starting to see all kinds of connections. And if you could see, there's a separate picture there of Fidel Castro Street, which is very close. You could see it from where this church is. And you might ask, why were Cubans also in this picture? If you have experience with the history of the Cold War, you might have some answers to propose to that already. We won't dive into those too much today, but I'll let that sit in the background for you a bit as we move forward. So with that question, what is this, a matter of perspective or a limit of historical knowledge? I'd ask you, when you look at this exhibit here, which is from the building called the Kaffeemaschine, what do you see that, what sticks out to you in this image? I can ask it rhetorically, not that you have to chime in. So this is an exhibit that's part of a much broader exhibit on different groups and their activities in the liberation struggle. This one is on, obviously, the role of the church. So when you look at this, I guess I could ask you, what information do you come away with from this image? Probably not a whole lot. And do you notice any difference between this, and I'm asking rhetorically, you don't have to chime in if you don't want to, but you're welcome to, between this exhibit and the one that is directly beside it? They're two separate pictures, but the second image is on the right. What you'll notice pretty quickly is that while the first image has no descriptors and indeed has images that are more connected to the legacy of colonialism than the liberation struggle, not that those are separate things, but in the historiography, we would approach it and speak of it in different ways. You would see here, you would see here a difference. This thing is driving me nuts. Okay, there we go. Between these two, namely in that while they are quite minimal, you do still have descriptions, at least, of what was taking place in these youth resistance um, movements. And so, an interesting contrast as we're stepping into this discussion is not only one of perspective, but as we can see, also one perhaps of needing to flesh out this picture a bit in our understanding of Namibian liberation. So I'm going to try to do that just a bit in the coming moments. I will take us through some basics of admittedly contested but sort of important foundational understandings of Namibian political and religious history. Then I will give two sort of case studies very briefly for understanding the role of international ecumenical organizations in the Namibian liberation struggle or the struggle for liberation in Namibia. To give you an idea here, we're going to talk a bit about maps in just a second, but if you can see this map that is on your screen now, a fun thing that I always say, or that people have said to me first, but now I borrow, is if you want to understand or remember what Namibia looks like, you can just hold out your hand like this and think of the northern sort of extension as your thumb and the rest of Namibia being the palm of your hand. And if you really want to orient yourself, you can think at the center of your palm of your hand there would be Windhoek, which is the capital of Namibia. So with that sort of geographic framing in mind, about which I'll talk more in a second, I also want to add a couple of introductory notes as we dive in. First of all, we will talk about some sensitive topics and I will share some graphic images, but I will notify you all of that before diving right in so that you can be prepared. And of course, if you need to log out at that time and then log back in, I'm sure Geneva can let you back in. The second thing I wanted to say is that this is a preliminary presentation of work that I've been engaged in for the past 9 months. And so you will notice at the end, in lieu of a conclusion, I will share a brief video and then also ask us to discuss. And then the final point, as far as a cautionary note, is that when one approaches the task of being a historian, they often have to ask questions like, why am I doing this? What are my aims? Many have chosen throughout history, I think in a very important and helpful way, to say that part of the historian's job is to engage in a search for the useful past. That's an important tradition, but there's a complementary tradition, I would say, that reminds us, in the words of a person who has been a mentor for this project for me, and is a great historian of Christianity in Africa, reminds us that not everything in history is a parable. So allowing ourselves to live in the tension between the search for the useful past in a recognition that political struggles are ongoing, the struggle for justice is an ongoing fight, and then also recognizing that sometimes the descriptive history process is important in its own right. Another quick point about methods, you won't see much of it until the very end, but the core component of this project, this broader project in which I'm involved, is oral history. So I've done quite a few Zoom interviews as well as in-person interviews in Namibia, just as to get a foundational understanding of how we are moving forward. By the end of it, we should have about 40 to 50 oral history interviews. Of course, that's also been complemented by archival research, from which you will see some samples here in Germany, in Wuppertal, and at the Day Mission Library and Special Collections at Yale Divinity School, at the United Methodist Archives and History Center at Drew University, at the Evangelische Kirche im Rheinland Archive, which is the Protestant church in this region that I'm in now, and then as well as a preliminary visit to a few archives in Namibia. Some notes about the theoretical framing as we dive in. The broader project of which I'm a part in Frankfurt is titled Decolonizing Post-Colonialism, on the role of the churches in Namibia's struggle for freedom, which is from 1957 to 1990. I've contained that a bit for our discussion this evening. And one of the core goals of our project is to try and understand and to join with others in articulating a Namibian contribution to the global discourse on liberation theology and Black liberation theologies in particular. Obviously, I do that in the sense of attempting to share other stories, recognizing my own social location in the process, which is pretty obvious if you see the screen. Another sort of helpful theoretical framing, at least for me, and for this particular presentation, has been the notion of diplomatic pluralism. There will be those diplomatic historians, as opposed to the humble church historians like myself, who will say that essentially the history of diplomacy is a discussion about the history of relations between states, and that only state representatives can therefore be considered under the purview of diplomatic history. I say, well, I could say it nicer, but basically pish posh to that. And indeed, that we need to be pluralistic in our consideration of who count as actors, even as international actors on the world stage. And I think we will have at least two exhibits in the case for that position today. So, given that I'm giving a presentation at the Interfaith Center at Miami University, why did I choose to use the term ecumenical instead of interfaith? Now, of course, we know that as the way we often conceive it, the term ecumenical can be inclusive of interfaith work, but it can also refer to intra-Christian discussions, at least in historiography. And the reason I chose this is pretty straightforward. The population in Namibia is roughly 3.3 million people, though the statistics are debated on all these points, but I think that's roughly accurate. So we could say roughly 3 million people. And of that population, 97% identify as Christian. Of that 97%, 43.7% identify as Lutheran, more even than in Germany, as far as a percentage is concerned. And so we can see that this ecumenical discussion is historiographically significant, though I look forward with great expectation to a chance to learn more about interfaith engagement on these topics, which is certainly part of the conversation as well. I told you before we would dive into some maps in our discussion. And if you recall, I mentioned holding out the hand, so you can keep that image in your mind as what the sort of current borders of Namibia looks like. Of course, like most borders, not only in Africa, but in the United States and many other places, the current borders that are drawn on our map are the result of a long legacy of either settler or other expressions of colonialism. So prior to the arrival of European colonists, the land that is now modern-day Namibia was inhabited by a great many different tribes. It still is to this day, of course, including the Herero, the Nama, and of course the San people, who are largely considered to be the indigenous population who were there before other groups migrated to Namibia. That's an important discussion in contemporary Namibian society as well, of course. So this gives you a bit of a picture of what the early missionaries, when we get to talk about them, would have been introduced to in these environments, and helps us to understand why when we talk about the history of colonization in Namibia, or even the history of the liberation struggle in Namibia, we have to recognize that this is not a single story or a single narrative. that in addition to geographical experiences, different cultures encountered colonialism and struggled for independence in sometimes unified and sometimes diverse ways. That I would, again, always invite Namibian friends to say more about than I ever could. So just to give you a basic timeline of the history of Namibia, so we'll start sort of zooming way out. It's interesting. I'm based in Germany now, and so of course, when I first found Marian Wallace's important text, The History of Namibia, Geschichte Namibias, I found the German version. Lo and behold, I found out actually it was originally written in English. So there's a great book if you want to find it by Marian Wallace, The History of Namibia. So I have done a bad practice here and translated a translation back into English because that's the book I had in front of me. So you can bear with me on that point. She dates the sort of pre-colonial history to Namibia as coming up to 1730. There's a discussion around that because Dutch colonists were to some degree active in different parts prior to that. But largely we can describe Namibia before 1730 as being pre-colonial. The first sort of real substantive trade connections were established in the south and in central Namibia. So if we were to go back to the map here, that would be essentially here up to here, which would be the central part. And this was parallel, though not exactly coinciding with much more contentious engagement between European powers and indigenous communities in the north, basically leading up to what is known as a genocide, a German genocide in Namibia from 1904 to 1908. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Amidst all of this, there is an extensive discussion around how exactly German colonialism came to Namibia and was enshrined in Namibia. I think Marian Wallace does a helpful job of really, instead of trying to find a single event and saying this is the moment, whether it's the establishment of Lutherans and so on, of locating this on a continuum from 1870 to 1893. And describing it as the shadow of protection, because the idea was that the Kaiser would come and offer protection. It's a classic protection racket in many ways, actually. But it developed in many different dimensions in different parts of Namibia at different times. By the time we get to 1884, however, we can talk of the foundation of Deutsche Südwestafrika, German Southwest Africa, and a rule that was largely established and becomes more solidified only even 10 years after the official pronouncement is made by 1894. From 1904 to 1908, we have what some people might call the German-Namibia Wars, what others call a period of genocide. And we won't dive into that too much today, but we can certainly have a discussion about that afterwards, as it is extremely important. After 1908, however, we can speak more convincingly even than before of a solidified German rule over what is now modern-day Namibia. I wrote successful there in quotes because successful implies the deprivation of land and rights for the people who were there to begin with. But from a colonial perspective, success can be talked about in that time. However, amidst World War I, the Germans lost their colonial possessions. And from 1915 to 1946, we could talk about the beginnings of South African rule related to British colonial history in South Africa as well. And after 1946, when South Africa took on the mandate for caring for, really is supposed to be, Namibia, we can speak of the beginnings and application of the laws that are collectively known as apartheid from 1946 to 1970. And of course, those continued long after. But we say 1970 because at least by 1971, again, a contested debate because in the late 60s, there was a lot of engagement with SWAPO and other political parties. We could start describing the long war of independence and resistance as having taken place, which culminated, of course, on March 21st, 1990, in Namibia's Day of Independence. And so I'm now going to talk about a little bit of that colonial history. And I say here that if you need to log out for a bit to take a break, because it's going to be some tough conversations and some difficult images, I invite you to do that now. I think you can log off and then Geneva, you could log right back in. Geneva would let you in as well. But if you feel like staying around, we can have a brief discussion about the German genocide in Namibia. I won't dive so much into the history of the event itself as we're focusing primarily on the liberation struggle, but I just want to point you to two resources of several. The first is probably the most famous, the book, The Kaiser's Holocaust, Germany's Forgotten Genocide, which you can get on any online platform. And another is a bit harder to get, but it's by Namibian authors, Nuanced Considerations, Recent Voices in Namibian German Colonial History. And I would say putting these two texts in conversation would be very helpful. Quite germane to our conversation today is not only the history of the genocide itself, but also the historical memory and the role that that plays today in Namibian society. So to give you a couple of examples of that, the first image here, which I just borrowed from Wikipedia, is from 2005, is of the Südwester Ritter, the southwestern knight, or the rider, or Das Ritterdenkmal, which is the rider's monument, which commemorates the German soldiers who fought in basically the various colonial wars in order to establish German rule in modern-day Namibia. The second is a covered image which is being removed in 2022 of Kurt Karl Bruno von Francois, which was removed, like I said, in 2022 amid great protest and consternation when these protests were happening in many points around the world. Francois was a leader in the founding of Windhoek and a Hauptmann, a commander in the German Schutztruppen, which were largely responsible for several atrocities in this conflict. Francois was also responsible largely for leading the construction of this space, which is the German colonial fortress. It's not so imposing from this side because, you know, there are other buildings have been built up around it. But if you look from the other side, it had been modified since then, but this is what it might have looked like from the other end, quite imposing structure. The Ritter Denkmal, which I mentioned, was subsequently removed after the Francois Denkmal and was moved inside the old German fortress. And you can see it here being held up by trusses. And it's closed to the public at this time, but I was able to visit. And an interesting thing about the point of the fact that this is a living discussion in Namibia, which might not be as evident to us out here. Although I think we probably all, I'm from the US, as you know, have had recent discussions around the roles that monuments play in our societies. And so an interesting point about the contested memory that goes into discussions of colonization and genocide is if you look at this Ritterdenkmal and you look down at the floor, you will see a small red object. I don't know who put it there. I asked around and I couldn't figure it out. But I should have gotten closer and taken a picture. But if you get closer, you can see it's a candle inside, a sharp heart-shaped candle. So amidst all of these discussions, someone, I have no idea who or what their background would have been, we might make assumptions about that, but we don't know, um, felt the need to still commemorate this figure of German colonial expansion even today. And interestingly, the workers who were there, the person who was my guide was Nama. He felt like leaving that there. He didn't want to remove the candle because he thought it, like I was just saying, testified to the ongoing nature of this conversation. Right outside of that building is this monument has several names, but a lot of people call it by the name Their Blood Waters Our Freedom Monument because that's what's written there. If we were to zoom in on this text, we could see, or on this picture, we could see an artistic rendering of an infamous photo that is connected to the accusations of genocide during this time. And like I said, it's quite graphic, but this is plays a pivotal role in Namibia's understanding of its own self and its own history. Within the Coffee Machina that I talked about, there are various other spaces, one of which commemorates alongside one another the genocide and the slave trade, which is complex in history relating those two specifically in this context. But nonetheless, you can see here chains and then a rendering of that same infamous image as well, which this is a closer up vision of that commemorating the date in which these events are said to have happened. Not far from those sites that I was just talking about, if trees were not there, I think you could probably see it from where it is the old zoo park in Windhoek, which was also a German colonial era park. As well as some other things after that. But one of the monuments that is there commemorates not just the sort of idealized image of the rider, the German rider, but instead commemorates the many of the actual names of the German soldiers who died in the conflict. And you can see here someone has added their thoughts to this, saying fuck Germany over the top of the names of the people who are written there. And then on the other side, instead of say rest in peace, you have here rest in hell. So you can see it is quite a live discussion. Why am I talking about all that? Because these broader cultural discussions are not separate from conversations about the role of the church in Namibia's history. I've not been able to confirm where this actual image is, but it's one of the only other references to the church in the National Independence Museum. And so I'm not absolutely sure that this is what it is, but I haven't found any evidence to the contrary either. It says here you will see German troops present arms to welcome their pastor to Swakopmund, which is a city in Namibia. And so you can see here this discursive link between the German colonial legacies and the institutional forms of Christianity in Namibia put on vivid display. So, with all that said, and definitely not separated from that conversation, there are some parallel events that we need to keep in mind here, too, as far as the development of Christianity in Namibia. Though they didn't have a whole lot of long-term success, the London Missionary Society, the LMS, are said to have been the first to arrive in 1806. Two brothers with a very German name, Abraham and Christian Albrecht, were the first to establish a mission in Namibia. And then once again, the Methodists, who also didn't really have a lot of success until in the 20th century, as far as establishing long-term ties, established missionary outposts as well. They went in 1820 and then established the first missionary settlement at Bush Fountain in 1821. That one failed or fizzled. Then in Fish River, they established a second one in 1825. Perhaps the most important event outside of Namibia for Namibia's Christian history was the seemingly obscure from an American perspective, I imagine, um, merger of the Barmen and Elberfeld mission societies in Germany into what was known then as the Rhenish Missionary Society. This merger took place in 1828 and is still today, it's known today as the United Evangelical Mission and is one of Germany's most active, maybe the most active mission society around the world. And it does have a pietist sort of bent to it, but is affiliated with the broader German Lutheran and Reformed and United churches. They were more active in Namibia, not right away, but from 1842 onwards. I'll skip down a bit just for the purposes of time to 1870, where another sort of important event in the history of Christianity in Namibia uh, took place, which was the arrival of the Finnish mission that set out under the auspices of the Finnish mission based in Helsinki in 1870 to found what would become the predecessor of the Evangelical Lutheran Ovambo Kavango Church, which is today the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Namibia, or the Elson, and is still quite representative in the northern part of the country. In 1870, I think more we could say the 1870s, we can see the arrival of Afrikaner Dutch Reformed churches beginning to show themselves more prominently in Namibia. By the 1890s, the Evangelical Church of Germany is established to combine or at least to coordinate different efforts between missions to the indigenous people and clerical work with the settler groups. And then by 1896, we see the establishment of a successful Roman Catholic mission in Namibia. By 1824, the Anglican mission has begun its work among the Ovambo regions. And even today, I think it has now been beat that there is a smaller cathedral somewhere. But if you look on your screen, you'll see what was, at least for a long time, the smallest, at least Anglican cathedral in the world. It is humble, but it's quite beautiful from my perspective. Other Dutch Reformed churches, given the relationship and occupation by South Africa, of course, began to play a greater role in the 1920s. The Seventh-day Adventists made their way across the pond in 1921 and began establishing missions. In 1926, we see an important transition toward the independent functioning of churches in Namibia when the Church Union Kirchenbund is formed for South Africa and Namibia, uniting the German Lutheran churches there. The UCC, which had shown a strong showing at the beginning in 1806, the Congregationalist churches, again showed up again by 1939 and began to have a greater presence. We could do a whole presentation about the presence of the AME in Namibia. Of course, that would be powerful, no doubt. But we can say by the 1940s that the African Methodist Episcopal missionaries were also active in Namibia, and especially from 1946 onward, had actually led a successful, we might say, exodus from the Rhenish churches into the formation of the AME churches in Namibia, called AMEC in this context. The Pentecostals make a strong showing from the 1942 onwards, and the Baptists were latecomers to this conversation, although they had a mission connected to other work from 1910 onwards. We can see the establishment of a Baptist community in 1983. So that's like a very broad timeline, and I know it's information overload, but I say it because these crazy acronyms and important little groups become important in the final phase of our discussion today. And as you can see from the image on the slide, it is important for people who are having these conversations in Namibia. This I just happened to be walking through the intercity Lutheran church and saw this and asked if I could take a picture, of course. This is the chalkboard from a confirmation class, and you can see here the teacher was explaining this sort of denominational history I was talking about, at least part of it, with the different Lutheran communities as well. So far, we've largely been talking about mission history and its evolution into the founding of independent churches in Namibia. We are now also need to transition to thinking of self-governing churches, of course, that we're dealing with political repression. We should keep in mind in the context of Namibia. And by this point, we can start thinking, say in 1925, that the Finnish mission we would have thought of as being run primarily from Finland, and then having rulings applied in the Namibian context, as evolving into its own church, the Elsen, as it said. By 1957, the Rhenish mission had evolved. First, it had a different name, but eventually evolved into the ELCRN, which is the largest church in Namibia. The Dutch Reformed and Afrikaner churches also had their independence that year. I already mentioned the AME churches. And we also see that by 1960, the German settler churches had also gained their independence to form the GELK, the German Evangelical Lutheran Church, though, of course, they did have their own synod since 1926 and a measure of independence in that context. From the 1950s onwards, we also have the rise of what are called by scholars, though now by practitioners as well, African independent churches, or AICs, that are a blend of many different kind of traditions and have many different local expressions, but are nonetheless important. So with that background in mind, with all those acronyms flooding our head, but you all are interfaith workers, so you're used to it. We can now ask some questions and perhaps see a couple of exhibits in the case for understanding the role that the church and the churches played in the struggle for an independent Namibia. I don't know if many of you have heard of the open letter of 1971, but this is one of, I would argue, and far more reputable people have argued before me, is perhaps one of the most important documents in Namibia's history. Anglican Bishop Colin Winter, who was exiled under the South African regime, called it Namibia's Declaration of Independence. Of the open letter, Professor Dr. Paul John Isaac has said that the open letter in 1971 started the process of conscientization of the Namibian nation. It offered a window of opportunity to the religious and political bodies to play a major role in the liberation struggle of Namibia. That's the legacy, he says, of the open letter. The open letter was prompted when news of the International Criminal Court, the ICC's decision calling South Africa's occupation of Namibia illegal on the 21st of June, 1971, reached Namibia. It was written mostly, although this is an ongoing discussion about the different actors who were involved in the composition of this text, but it was written and attributed to students of the Evangelical Lutheran Seminary, the main seminary in Namibia, which is simply called the Paulinum most of the time. So it was composed by these students. It was in part circulated to the churches and then subsequently adopted. It's a long conversation that took place beforehand by the ELCIN, it should say. That's the wrong acronym. The ELCIN, the ILSEN, and the ELCRN, but not by the historic German settler church, the GELC. And this is an important point because there had been an agreement prior to this that largely under pressure from outside forces, that these three Lutheran churches would issue such statements together. But of course, I think it's pretty clear that if the two churches, which were comparatively racially inclusive, had waited on the German settler community to contribute, that this letter would not have been produced in the same way. So that is a contested part of the history, but it's nonetheless important to note. In this text, the authors of this text make it very clear. They drew on three primary sources. First, the Bible, which is seen by any theologian that I have spoken to so far, and there have been many, from a Namibian context, as the foundation for their approach. What the others may have other approaches, for their approach to the liberation struggle in Namibia, in conversation with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the UN Charter, to which South Africa was officially party, and thus on the basis of which such a letter calling for action in defense of Namibian liberation could be issued. There was an expectation, especially given this sort of three-party relationship that was expected between the three main Lutheran churches in Namibia, that while there may have been some consternation raised over the crisis and over South Africa's rule, that essentially the churches would land where many of the other churches in South Africa had landed. Of course, we know that that doesn't hold true with the issuing of the Barman Declaration and other texts, that essentially the churches would rely on various versions of and approaches to Romans 13 and the two kingdoms doctrine, essentially saying that while we may have this was the expectation, while we may have our debates with the government, God has placed these governing authorities in authority, and therefore we are obedient. That is not this tact that the open letter takes. In a conclusion to the open letter, in its final form that was circulated to the churches, we read, instead of this Romans 13 approach, our urgent wish is that your government, speaking of the South African government, and speaking specifically to the President of South Africa, will seek a peaceful solution to the problems of our land, and will see to it that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights be put into operation, and that Southwest Africa may become a self-sufficient and independent state. As we sort of move on to the final exhibit in this case that I wanted to offer to you, as far as the church's role in the struggle for independence and the global ecumenical role, I will give a bit more of a preparatory remark to this final piece. So far, I haven't talked much about SWAPO, the Southwest Africa People's Organization, excuse me, which is still to this day the governing party in Namibia, and was the political the group into which the various voices calling for liberation consolidated. There were, of course, other groups before this, predecessors. It's an interesting discussion about the role and the relationship of SWANO to SWAPO, in which I am not an expert, but we can just say that this is a long and complex discussion. And we must also at this point get to an acknowledgement that in addition to being a rhetorical struggle for freedom, the struggle for an independent Namibia was also an armed struggle. And the military arm of SWAPO is known as PLAN, P-L-A-N, People's Liberation Army. According to the official history, though the democratic process here is debated, again, that part is beyond my competence to say. Many people date the beginning of modern SWAPO to the election of Samuel Nujoma as president of SWAPO. Of course, he went on to be the first president of Namibia as well, on the 19th of April, 1960. It's also very important, we could talk more about this, to recognize that by the end of that same year, because of the measures taken by the South African occupying forces, SWAPO had largely, its leadership had largely been in exile. There were, of course, people in Angola and other places, the exile in Angola. There were, of course, people still active in the struggle, as people are hastened to remind me often in conversations within Namibia. But the leadership largely had to function from outside the state or the borders of the country, like I said, mainly in Angola. In the vacuum created by a South African government that was refusing to often provide some of the basic needs of the various population groups, and the fact that the group advocating for independence was largely in exile. Into that vacuum, in many cases, stepped a very important organization in the history, not only of Christianity in Namibia, but I think in the history of Christianity in the past century. Founded out of a group and discussions that took place around the Christian Faith Center in the 1970s, we have the Council of Churches in Namibia, the CCN, which was formally established, like I said, with a prehistory in 1978. This organization is important for a lot of reasons. One of those is that it represents not only 18 member denominations, that's an accomplishment in its own right, but that both Catholics and Protestants joined together. The fact that Catholics joined this group while having a complicated relationship with the WCC caused no small amount of consternation in many parts of the world. And yet, the churches in Namibia were largely, not completely, there were other churches who did not join, united in this organization. By the 1980s, the CCN was the most representative organization of Namibians at that time, with representing, through the membership of the churches, over 80% of the population. To quote one scholar, the CCN was, of course, closely identified with SWAPO, serving in some respects as an alternative internal wing of the organization. This very same article goes on to say that this did not necessarily result in the democratization of the church experience. It was a very complex situation. As I said, this was an armed struggle. Complementing the work of the CCN and deeply connected to it were broader international ecumenical ties. We won't talk about it today, but confessional communions like the Lutheran World Federation, at that time, the Alliance of Reformed Churches, were deeply involved as well. But the exhibit that I want to provide today, as we begin to wrap up, comes from the World Council of Churches Program to Combat Racism, or the PCR. At the Fourth Assembly of the World Council of Churches that met in Uppsala, Sweden in 1968, the Assembly issued a mandate that the church respond constructively to combat racism. The mechanisms by which to do that were forthwith to be established by the Council of the World Council of Churches, by the Executive Council. Also at that 1968 assembly, we cannot forget that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was scheduled to speak there, but was assassinated before he could. This evoked great, of course, outrage and great empathy in those who had gathered for the council. That empathy was further channeled by the person who stepped in to offer a speech when Dr. King could not, James Baldwin, and you can see here his guest name tag for the assembly. Following on this mandate issued by this assembly, which again was infused with more than just the sort of programmatic component that you might expect from a World Council of Churches meeting, was infused with great passion by these experiences of King's assassination and then Baldwin stepping in to speak, was a call to live into this mandate and to add real meat to the bones of the mandate. One of the key steps toward making this happen took place in May 1969 as a WCC-funded consultation on racism took place at the Notting Hill Ecumenical Center. This Notting Hill meeting then went on, as often happens in ecumenical settings, to provide the basic framework for what eventually became the establishment of the program to combat racism. And it was a heck of a meeting. it was highly confrontational. That's why I say an almost revolution at Notting Hill. It was highly confrontational. I don't want to give a picture of this meeting that everybody was on the same page, but it did three very important things. One, it called for a global discussion around reparations and even went on to call for a conversation about reparations on a global scale. It called for boycott, divest, and sanction movements of various regimes, but especially of the apartheid regime in Southern Africa. And most strikingly of all, it called the churches and the ecumenical movement to support armed struggles of Blacks against white rule. The response to this and the eventual founding of the program to combat racism is perhaps to be expected, and it was a global firestorm. The Sydney Sun declares churches aid guerrillas, guerrilla cash row flares, and then down below the arms, referring to arms given, which was not the case, but arms given to guerrilla fighters, Pope concerned. Anti-racist groups of perhaps more positive appraisal get church aid. And then we see even here an Italian newspaper reading Protestants, though Catholics were involved. It is an Italian newspaper, I guess. So Protestants are funding guerrilla warfare in South Africa. It goes on, Forster, the South African president, offers peace pacts to Blacks, but churches warned to quit the World Council because of this funding. Others called these measures the height of folly, and even a French magazine talked about the church funds for revolutionaries. So, of course, funding did go to support the political arms of people who were involved with SWAPO. There were many people whom I have interviewed who talked about the fact that without the program to combat racism, given the policies of apartheid, they would never have received the education they needed to go on and to support the liberation struggle. I have to say that at this stage in my own research, I can't speak to with any degree of confidence into the messy situation as to what parts of the struggle were actually supported by the church. There are many opinions, and some of which are well substantiated, others are not. The general argument seems to be that while the program to combat racism did not support the purchasing of any weaponry or violence, there can't be full accountability for those numbers. Like I said, I can't personally substantiate that yet. So that's an ongoing discussion. But I raise it here to show you the level at which the global ecumenical movement was deeply entrenched in the struggle for an independent Namibia, not only through relationships with key actors inside the country, like the CCN, which provided a safe space for people of many political persuasions to gather together, because the church was one of the few places that wasn't where gatherings were not limited by the South African regime, but also as we look outside, not only to the conceptual role that the things like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the WCC's affirmation of that text, but also the role that concrete involvement and financing played in this discussion, even as many of the churches, including my own, the Presbyterian Church, come from nations that in their foreign policy had a different stance than the churches who were advocating in this way. Looking back, it appears to me quite harrowing. And one of the heroines from the Lutheran World Federation that I believe is an important voice to listen to can provide us perhaps a final word that I would offer to you in lieu of a conclusion, because at this stage, I'm not ready to offer conclusions, as I've already said, but instead to provide you with information and a discussion. And since I have not had a conversation about having this his interview recorded, I'll go ahead and ask Geneva to stop